Hello, my name is Hanna. I'm the maker and designer behind HERBGARDEN knitwear, and usually you find a knitting podcast on this channel as well as knitting tutorials and the occasional Q&A video. But today's video is a little bit different. Today we want to talk about what makes a knitting pattern a good pattern. This whole discussion was inspired by a post I shared on Instagram recently. You can go back and read that if you want to. I will try to link it below in the description box, but I don't want to repeat all of that because we had already a lovely discussion on Instagram over there. And today's video I want to use to sum up all the very helpful and interesting answers you wrote in the comments and in the question sticker on Instagram. And I really want to thank everyone who joined this discussion because I found it so interesting. And I think in talking about what makes a knitting pattern a good pattern, we can improve the whole way it is currently in the fiber industry. I think both knitters and designers really benefit if most patterns out there are good written patterns, because on the one hand the knitter obviously benefits from good patterns as they are better to read, easier to work from, but I think also designers would benefit from more really good patterns being out there, because I have made the experience more than once that if a rather new knitter or a knitter who has not often used indie patterns, if they get a pattern that is really bad, they get really discouraged, and I think that is so sad because there are so many so good patterns out there, and I don't want them to miss out on that, and I don't want the designers to lose customers just because there was this one pattern and that was not good. So let's talk about this. Let's have a discussion about what makes a pattern a good pattern. One thing that people answered was that they made the experience that most of the times indie patterns are easier to understand, more detailed, and more beginner friendly than patterns in magazines, books, or in those pattern books that come from yarn companies. So usually when a yarn company has like a new yarn drop, like if the seasons change, then usually there's a pattern book with, for example, spring and summer patterns using their spring and summer yarns. And patterns from those sources like magazines, books, and yarn companies' pattern books are usually a lot more condensed, which might be just because those are often patterns that come in print, like in physical magazines. So you obviously don't have as much space as an indie designer has in their PDF patterns. So that may be one reason why those patterns are often not as detailed, not as easy to understand. I made the same experience when I knit from German patterns or German magazines. I usually find that indie designers have a much detailed pattern, but many of you agreed that it's always kind of a gamble. So if you buy a pattern from an indie designer, you can have a very good, very detailed pattern, easy to understand with a lot of details, but sometimes you just get a pattern that is so difficult to understand and so hard to follow that you just stop working on it. Many of you reported that they have bought patterns and they were so disappointed that they dropped the project and just went for something else. And it would be lovely if we, could find some sort of measurements, some sort of signs, how we can distinguish the good patterns from the not so good ones. And one thing that was mentioned quite a lot, if it was the fact if the pattern was written in English and whether English was the original language or whether the pattern was translated. And that is an experience that I made myself as well. I usually prefer to knit from English patterns. And even, so I'm a German native speaker, and even if a pattern is available in German and in English, I usually prefer using the English pattern, because I find that the instructions are so much easier to understand, because the knitting terminology in German, I find it to be a lot more complex, and the knitting terminology in English is a lot easier, in my opinion. And I found that many of you answered the same. I had comments about Danish and Dutch patterns, and it seems to be agreed at least on Instagram, that when in doubt, then going for an English pattern will result in a better pattern than going for a translated one. Which is very interesting to me, because as a designer I was often asked in the past by fellow Germans if my pattern was also available in German, which it is not right now. All my patterns are currently only available in English, because I don't have the time to translate them. And now I am for the first time reconsidering if I want to translate them in the future at all, because how sad would that be if somebody who was interested in the pattern would no longer be interested in it because of the translation, because they may fear that the translation is not good. So now I will still have to think about this, but now I'm quite happy that I only published them in English. Because when I think about it, I made the same experience. Whenever I tried to knit from a German pattern, it was a lot harder than the English ones. So kind of an interesting thing to know. So, and let's have a look at all the things that you guys mentioned that you look for when you look at patterns online. So one thing that was mentioned is whether the pattern is size inclusive, which I think is very interesting, especially as in books and magazines, there are usually less sizes than in any patterns in my experience. There is one yarn company pattern that I looked at recently that only had 3 sizes, which is quite amazing in a bad sense, like shocking to me, because it was published within the last year. So it's kind of weird that companies still don't make the effort to grade many sizes, while indie designers who don't make money actually do. So that was very interesting, and I agree. If you want to make sure that a pattern is a good pattern, you can always look how many sizes there are. But of course, and this is a thing that another designer mentioned, and I agree, you can also try and look at the schematic and how the sizes are graded. So does the upper arm circumference for a certain size and the bust circumference for the same size, does that make sense together? Or is maybe the upper arm circumference for the bust size like way too small or way too large? Like, does the proportions match? So what was mentioned by some of you, and what I would totally agree on, is look if the pattern has a schematic. So a schematic is a picture or a drawing of the finished item with measurements on the sides, like a little arrow or something on the sleeve and saying this is the sleeve length. And usually I would say for a garment there should at least be the bust circumference, the upper arm circumference, the yoke depth for circular yoke sweaters or raglan style sweaters, and things like the body length and stuff like that. And I always try and see not only if the description of a pattern says it will have a schematic, but if the schematic is available to you before you buy the pattern. So I usually add the schematic to the photos of the Ravelry pattern page so that people can look at all the measurements before buying the pattern. So that would be a sign for me that the pattern is rather a good one than a bad one. And what kind of plays in that same topic, in that same sizing and measurements thing, is that many of you answered that it is important to them that they can see this item knit by other knitters and how it fits on different body types. And I totally agree. This is why, as a designer, this is one of the reasons why I use test knitters. There are many other reasons too, but this is one of the major reasons that I want to see if the grading is not only fine, like number-wise, like mathematical, but also if it fits as I intended. So that is something I would look for too. If I buy a pattern, I always check, are there other projects? How does the sweater, the hat, the scarf, whatever, look on the people wearing them? This is very important to me too. And another thing that was mentioned, and which makes total sense, that people look if the pictures that the designer has taken are good quality pictures. And of course, if those pictures are not from good quality, then you would not be able to tell if the fit is good. And once again, from a designer's perspective, it's the same thing. I always love if both test knitters and also customers who bought the pattern take the time and make good quality photos. That means everything to me, because it both helps me to see if my design worked as I intended it to work, but it also helps other people to see how the design really fits on different body types. So I often get asked how you can support indie designers, and that is one very simple and easy easy way that takes you no money at all is if you make an item from this designer, share as many good quality pictures of it on all the platforms that you can, because that helps both the designer and all the knitters out there who are interested in this design. So let's talk about the information on top of the pictures and the sizes that can be included in the pattern description that may help distinguish good patterns from bad ones. So one thing that was mentioned by you in the comments was that information regarding gauge is very important, and I think that's totally right. I would always include all the information you need to swatch in the pattern description so that you do not have to buy the pattern in order to swatch. I want you to be able to swatch first so that you then can decide if you want to buy the pattern or not. So you obviously need all the gauge information, which stitch pattern should it be worked flat or in the round, should it be washed and blocked, all that. So you need a stitch and a row gauge, in my opinion, and of course you need a needle size to start with. So that is usually the needle size that the designer used, but of course it does not matter which needle you use in order to achieve the gauge. That is totally up to you, because every knitter is different, but I think it is still very helpful if a needle size is given so that you have a starting point where you can start to swatch with. Other things that were mentioned is that you like if the techniques that are used in this pattern are mentioned briefly, and also if there is a description on the construction. So is the sweater worked bottom up or top down? Is it worked in the round, flat, etc., etc. Then another thing that I find so great that this is mentioned, because I often missed it when I work patterns, is that it's good if there's a recommendation for the sizing. So at least there should be a sentence like, this item is intended to be worn with 5 centimeters or 4 inches or whatever of positive or negative ease. So some information regarding how this pattern is intended to be worn should be there. And I think on top of that, it is very good if the designer is open to share that which size the sample is and on which size body it is pictured. So I always write something the sample shown is worn on a 95 centimeter bust circumference with about 3 centimeters of positive ease, so that the knitters who look at the sample can tell how much ease I have, because sometimes that is very difficult to say, so that they have some kind of idea how the fit is with this amount of ease, so that they can decide for themselves how much ease they want for their version of the sweater. So that was mentioned, and I totally agree. This is very important to me too. When I knit from other people's patterns, I want to know how much ease the fit should have per intention of the designer. Then what I also find very interesting is that some people also love to hear information about the designing process from the designer and the idea behind the pattern. Of course, that information is not typically necessary, but it still shows that the designer put in some effort to give you as much information about the pattern as he or she can. And I think that is also just something that is very fun to read. So it was lovely that that was mentioned in the comments by one of you. Of course, that is kind of something that we already discussed. It is important to people that the pattern has been test knit, and of course for a designer that is very important as well. What I've found interesting is that the only people who mentioned tag editing as a quality sign for a pattern was another designer and a tag editor. So none of the knitters mentioned that tag editing might be a thing they look out for. So they do not check whether the pattern, or at least none of them mentioned. So this is, let me ask you to drop a comment below, please. Is that something you do not check at all? If a pattern is tag edited, do you maybe not even know what tag editing is? Do you not care so much about tag editing as long as the pattern is test knit? This is something that from my point of view as a designer is very, very interesting, because I would never ever dare to publish a sweater design without having it tag edited, because I find there are just so many ways to make errors in a sweater pattern that I really want to have someone to check all my numbers before I even give the pattern out to the test knitters. So please, that is something that is not quite clear to me yet. For me, as a designer, I would always look if the pattern is tag edited, but that was not mentioned at all. So please let me know. Did you look for that? Did you just forget to mention it? Is that something you have never thought of? That would be very interesting to me. Let's maybe have a discussion in the comments below. And what I also totally agree upon is that people mentioned that they really like to read other people's feedback on patterns, no matter if it's in Ravelry comments or in the project notes on Ravelry or in Instagram posts, or even if it is like a podcaster talking about a pattern or reviewing a pattern, or no matter how you call it. Like, if you have some other knitter's perspective on how good a pattern was, that was one of the major signs of quality that many of you mentioned, which I totally understand. If there's someone who has knit the pattern and lets you know it worked well, it worked fine for me, then the risk of it being very bad is very low. So that makes total sense. And that, let's just say, I think that is also one way why some patterns are knit by so many people in a short amount of time, because it kind of snowballs. Like if someone knits it and then says it was such fun to knit, then so many other people will want to work it too. So that makes sense. What kind of is very similar to that thought is that many of you answered that they stick to or avoid designers depending on which experience they have made with the patterns from that designer. So if you have knit a pattern or if you have attempted to knit a pattern from a designer that did not work out at all, then more than one person said they would never attempt to try any other pattern from the same designer, which is very interesting to me, because let's imagine I have now about 30 patterns out there, and if there was a knitter who found one of those patterns not easy to understand, then I will lose a customer for all of these patterns, which makes total sense. As a knitter, I would do the same thing. That is not something I want to shame in any way. I would act in the very same way. But from a designer's perspective, this really stresses how important it is to put out really good quality patterns, because it works in the other way around too. If somebody has worked a pattern from a designer that worked very well, that was easy to knit, then you are very confident that another pattern from the same designer will be the same quality. And I have made that experience as well. I tend to go back to the same designers, not only because I like their style of designing, but also because I know what I get, what kind of quality I get when I knit from their patterns. So that really makes sense as a sign of quality, that I can go back to their patterns ever and ever again, and it is always good. What I didn't think of till now, till I read your comments, but what totally makes sense is that somebody said if they want to make a pattern from a designer that they have not yet worked from, then they check whether this designer is still active and still designing, which really blew my mind, because it makes so much sense. Because they said if the designer is still active, it is still available, then it will most likely be easy to get pattern support. They will probably answer your questions about the pattern, and they kind of also are still designing, which kind of means it works out for them, either because they are successful at what they do, or they just love it so much that they cannot stop doing it, like in my case. And I think that is also, if somebody does not make money with patterns at all and still not stops designing, then that kind of tells that somebody has a great passion for what they do. And as we have learned in all aspects of life, if somebody is really passionate about what they do, they usually are good at what they're doing. So super interesting thought to me. Check if the designer is still active and still designing, and that might be a sign that he or she puts out good quality patterns. So I think that was everything that you mentioned in the comments and that I want to recap in this video. So the information you guys are looking for is whether the pattern has been translated. You look on the information about the sizing, how many sizes are there, is it size inclusive, do you have a schematic giving a lot of measurements for this item, are there many pictures from other knitters on different body types, are there pictures both of the designer and the knitters, good quality pictures where you can see the item very clearly, are there also close-up pictures, are the information about the gauge, how much stitches and how much rows you need on 4 inches or 4 centimeters. The needle size used for that is the gauge, washed and blocked. What yarn is used. I totally forgot to mention that. The needed yarn that is used in the pattern. Then how's the pattern constructed, or the item, how is it constructed? Is it bottom up, top down? Then recommendations from other knitters, the feedback from other knitters, their notes and their Ravelry projects and the comments both on Ravelry and Instagram. Those are important quality signs. And I think all those are very important. And this is basically the same information that I, as a knitter, also check when I look for patterns. So if we have not mentioned something here, then please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you made the experience that if a pattern has all of this information, it is most likely a good pattern, or did you make bad experiences there as well? I would love to know that. Yes, so hopefully soon there also will be a new podcast episode, so stay tuned. I would really like if you would consider subscribing to this channel. It helps me out a lot to grow as a small indie designer. And you can also follow me over on Instagram, where I am HERBGARDEN knitwear as well. So thanks for watching all the way through this, and I hope this helps to put a little more thought into the way designers make patterns and the way knitters choose patterns, and it helps us all together to make our Fiverr community even greater than it already is. So have a lovely day. Bye.